that it is good for man to remain as he is. What's this present distress? I think it's really an expectation of persecution. I think Paul discerns that the persecution is coming. Now, he wrote this letter around 55 AD. It's right in the middle when this man Nero came into power. Who's Nero? Nero's one of the what? He's one of the leaders of Rome, right, that began to persecute the church. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD. So right in the beginning here, Paul's writing this letter in 55 AD. I think Paul knows that persecution's coming. And it's in this context. He says, this present distress, I suppose, therefore, that is good because of this present distress, that it is good for man to remain as he is. The NIV translates this passage as because of this present crisis. I believe he perceives that persecution's coming. What did Nero do? He killed Christians. He made sport of it. So this is why Paul is going to say that, if you're not married, it might be good. Now, it's one thing if you were persecuted. Men, women, if you were persecuted individually as a single, it's one thing, as hard as that would be. But can you imagine watching your wife or your husband persecuted or your children killed? This is the context that Paul's talking about. That I believe he's saying that there's persecution coming. Nero's in power. And he says, if you're single, it might be just as well. Because if you get married, there's a lot more to think about in this time of persecution. And you hear this in the missionary field. If they can't make you deny Christ because they threaten your life, you know what they're going to do? Threaten your wife and your kids. Can you imagine that? And so in this context here, Paul is saying, it might be just as well for you to remain single. A good thing. The Bible Knowledge Commentary writes this: the present crisis may have referred to persecution then being suffered by the Corinthians, or to an experience of suffering which Paul anticipated would shortly befall them, referring to Nero. In which case, the words could be translated impending crisis. There's going to be a crisis in the church here. A lot of you are going to be killed for your faith. In view of his silence in the letter about any present suffering on their part, the latter point of view, the translated is preferred. Impending crisis. There's going to be a future crisis. Still, when persecution came, as Paul felt it surely would, its onslaught could be handled more ably by single than married persons. I would agree with that. Let's say a nation came and started persecuting. I tell you, it's a lot easier to be single than to watch your family be persecuted. This is the context here. And so verse 27, are you bound to wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. What he's saying is what? Be content where you are. But even if you do marry, verse 28, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. So he says, it's not wrong to be married, and it's not wrong to be single, but to just be content. Clearly, Paul articulates that marriage is not a sin. It's not a sin to be married. But what they're teaching, and there's a lot of bad teaching that was going on in the Corinthian church, and you can see I think the expanse of the bad teaching even today. Some on one side, like, oh, you're really holy if you're not married. Well, you're not holy. You can be sinful if you're not married. Or you're really, answering the call if you're married. But no, Paul says, it's neither, really. It's be content where you are, right? Make God your priority. That's what he's saying. Clearly, Paul articulates that marriage is not a sin, but in the midst of the situation that's coming, the distress, the persecution, it might not be optimum. It would be difficult enough to personally be persecuted, but to watch your family be persecuted, this would be an unbearable trouble in the flesh. Maybe that's the trouble in the flesh he's talking about. When you see, right, your loved ones being persecuted. And this literally happened, people. This really happened. The persecuted church was from 100, I think, to 313 AD. They're getting towards that when it got full-blown. But Nero came in, right? And he started persecuting the Christians. And so he says this trouble in the flesh is going to happen if you're married. Verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short. Why don't you mark that? Time is short. What is he taking us to, right? He's taking us to eternity. This life is temporal. Anybody ever figure that out? Ever been to a funeral lately? Life is temporal, and that's actually pretty short, the older you get. The time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. You see, he says, have an eternal perspective. The time is short. Persecution is on its way. It will be difficult to be married. Persecution is on its way. You know, I think about Stephen when he was martyred. Did Stephen have his eyes on the temporal? Couldn't be, right? He had his eyes on Jesus, the eternal, right? In persecution, he looked and he saw the eternal. He's saying, persecution's coming. Get your eyes off of whether you're married or not married. You know what your eyes need to be on is Jesus, because a lot of you are going to be killed for your faith. Think about it. If we knew, if we can foresee, and we can't, but if we can foresee, let's say we can foresee that in 3 years, USA is going to be taken over, and Christians are going to be persecuted. Will you think about marriage so much? Or singleness so much? I don't think so. This is what he's saying here. He says, you know, get a grip. Things might be too easy. That's where you're thinking about these things. But when things are rough, you may not be thinking about these things. Priorities may change, huh? For us to see the value and high calling of our singleness, we need to see from an eternal perspective. I tell you that, I think that's true. Unless you see with an eternal perspective, you're not going to understand the value and high calling of singleness. You're going to want to always be married. You're going to be preoccupied with that. You're not going to have a what? An eternal perspective. You're going to have a what? A temporal perspective. Now let me just tell you this. Once you're married, is that temporal or eternal? It's temporal, people. What's eternal is what? Is your marriage with Jesus. Ephesians chapter 5. Verse 30. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. He's looking at the temporal. We weep temporal, right? But in that day, we're not going to weep. Our rejoicing here is temporal. In that day, we're going to rejoice what? Eternally. And he says, and those who buy as though they did not possess. What we possess here and what we buy here is temporal. You see what he's doing? He says, get your eyes on the eternal. The things we weep for, we long for, we rejoice in, we own. You know what? It's all going to be gone. Wood, hay, and stubble. Verse 31, and those who use this world as not misusing it. The NLT says it a little bit easier to understand. Those who use the things of the world should not become attached to them. Are you attached to anything in this world? You know what? It's not going to be here for too much longer. That car, that house. You know, I know this sounds kind of, but it's the truth, right? Even your spouse, even your children, even your parents. It's temporal, isn't it? Don't get attached. I'm not saying don't love them, right? But they're not eternal. Who's eternal? It's Jesus. Is your marriage to Jesus. You understand? For the form of this world is passing away. You know, we're not going to have time to read this, but you know, there's the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. And in that parable, you'll see just a man, right? He has these barns. And he's had more wheat and grain to put in the barns. He says, hey, I got to knock down these barns and build others. What did Jesus say? Are you crazy? He said, tonight your soul's going to be gone. We work so long, right? And so hard. We're so occupied with the temporal. And Jesus says, you're foolish. You're foolish. You know, and I think so often because we're not content, we strive for these things. And you know what? What if you knew you only had like a couple of days left? What if you knew you only had a year left? You know, the eternal perspective is so important to get our life in order. Verse 32, but I want you to be without care, Paul writes. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. And so this without care, it simply means without prohibition or unleashed, free. Right? So he wants us to be free. And he who is unmarried is free to serve the Lord in any whichever way he's led. Now think about Paul. If Paul was married and had kids, it'd be a problem, huh? You know how many times he was beaten? You know how many times he was shipwrecked? You know how many times he went without food? Would he have been able to provide for his family? Not in that ministry. Because sometimes he was starving. And I know Paul, obeying the scripture, he was married, he would have provided for his family. He would have gotten a job and said, okay. But he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. You understand? And so he says, I would rather have you without care, so you can devote your life this way. Now, let me ask you this. If you're single and you're not devoting your life this way, and you're always preoccupied with being married, get married. Right? Because he says, if you're single and you're doing these things, as Paul did, or you're just sold out, right? But you're not always, but there's people that are single and all they're thinking about is getting married. You understand? And it's kind of like a double whammy. Just get married and then serve as a married couple. Because you can serve awesome as a married couple too. Find a wife, find a husband, as soon as possible. Get married and get on with your life serving the Lord. Because so often we waste so much time and energy wanting to be married that we're not used as a single. You understand that? You see what he's saying here? To be free. But you're not free if you're in bondage to always want. And if you're always burning with passion, always want, get married so you can get on with serving the Lord. Verse 33, but he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And that's okay. If you're burning with passion, get married, and then that's okay. And then serve the Lord with your wife or with your husband. The married man devotes his attention to serving the Lord and serving his wife. That's a good thing too. Verse 34, there is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. I want you to note that. So, a virgin, right? Man or woman? Right? This one is talking about the woman, but it's really man or woman. That she may be holy in body and in spirit. She has really two concerns. To be holy in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband, and husband with wife, as he just mentioned, right? And so the platform kind of just expands, right, when you're married. It's not only being holy unto the Lord, but it's being, what, serving your spouse and your children if you have children. Verse 35, and this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. And, this putting a leash, I always have kind of like, our dog, right, putting on a leash. So I kind of smile with that. The NIV, I think, has it, and the NLT, it says not to restrict you, really, right? And so he says, not that I may restrict you, right? I say this to your own profit, not that I may restrict you. So he doesn't want to restrict you from being married. He says, if you need to be married, go ahead and be married. I'm just saying, what Paul is saying is that there's a lot of things you can do for the Lord as a single that you can't do as a married couple, right? There's an advantage of being single. So as you're single, take advantage of that advantage, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. Verse 36, but if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry. This is a kind of I don't want to spend too much time on this actually, but how many have an NLT Bible or NIV? It translates this different, and it's wrong. I believe it's wrong. It's my opinion, okay? What they translate this as that a virgin that this man is engaged to. Right? And I believe really it's more like the New King James. It's a father and his virgin daughter. And so you have a footnote in. It says virgin. The footnote, if you have your study Bible in the New King James, it's virgin daughter. And in that day, they would give their daughters to marriage. Right? And so the context here is that If any man, this is the father, thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin daughter, not the one he's engaged to, because it's a very different meaning here. And the NIV, the NLT, they say their fiancé. The NLT says his fiancé, but they interpret it wrongly, I believe. And so if you go to the NASB, and I was talking to Marcy about this, let's look at the NASB, which uses the same manuscripts as the NLT and the NIV. It's a word for word. It says virgin daughter. Okay, so I think the NLT and the NIV, they interpret this wrongly. Okay, they say a fiancé. That's the inference. But I believe it's the husband, or the man, the father, and his virgin daughter. And in that day, there was what? There was assigned marriages, right? They would assign you to, right, your spouse. And so what this is talking about is a father that wants to give his daughter away in marriage. In that day, this teaching here, right, if there's going to be persecution, it's better to stay unmarried. What do you say? No, but if the daughter is getting old and she wants to be married, it's okay for you to give her away in marriage, okay? I want to make that distinction. But the NIV, the NLT, I think it's not a good translation. It's an interpretive translation, you know, instead of word for word, right? It's thought for thought, and they interpret the thought. I think they interpret it wrongly. And so you want to read the NASB or the New King James, okay? So if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin daughter, not his fiancée, okay? If she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry, okay? So even in this time when Paul says that, you know, it's better to just stay unmarried, but if she is getting older and you really want to get her married and she wants to be married, he says it's okay. Let her marry, right? Give her away in marriage. Okay, verse 37. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. I want you to note this. No necessity. What does that mean? He's content. Or she's content. He doesn't have to give her. She's content. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart has no necessary power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart. You see, I want to make this kind of a point here, that oftentimes we think, well, you know, I don't have the gift of celibacy because I have a desire to be married. But do you know that there's many, I believe, that have a desire to be married, but they've made that sacrifice? I think this is what he's talking about. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, I don't need to be married, but has power over his own will. That means he has a will to be married, but you know what? God has caused them to offer that up. Very interesting. Because oftentimes, I don't have the gift because God didn't make me feel like not being married. Well, there's people, and I believe Anna the prophetess was like this. She was already married. I think she had a desire to marry. Remember the one that was hanging around the temple there, waiting for Jesus to be born? Comes there. She was already married. And as a young widowed, her husband died after 7 years, she stayed widowed. She did what Paul is instructing here. But it wasn't that she didn't have a desire to be married, I believe. And so there's many, they still have the desire to be married, but they offer that up. Does an offering cost? There's pain in the offering, isn't there? So there's ones who have a desire to be married, but they said, you know what, I'm going to sacrifice to serve the Lord. Wow. And I think this is what he's talking about here. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own what? His own will. And has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. Verse 38, so then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does even better. So what is it better? We can't deny this. He says it's better not to be married, to stay single. But he says it's still good to be married. You understand? And I would just say this. Paul is speaking from the context of himself. So but I think he's coming, it's better from my perspective, right? Because Paul couldn't do the things he did as a single if he was married. But he's saying here, marriage is good, but singleness is better. Better in terms of devoting time and energy to serving the Lord. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. So he's going back to ones that are widow, right? He's bringing that to law, that you're only free to marry once if your husband dies. And then Jesus talked about how infidelity, right, adultery, right, releases the other spouse from being married. One Rizvi writes, while both Paul and Jesus leave room for divorce under certain conditions, this can never be God's first choice for a couple. God hates divorce, Malachi chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. And certainly no believer should consider divorce until all avenues of reconciliation have been patiently explored. And then verse 40, but she is happier if she remains as she is. If you're widowed, what Paul is saying that you'd be happier just to remain as you and serve the Lord, according to what? His opinion, his judgment. And then he also says, and I think also I have the Spirit of God. So this is not a commandment, but he says according to what? My judgment, my opinion. If you've been wedded, better stay married and just devote yourself to the Lord. But there's nothing wrong if you do remarry. Right? You've been released to be remarried. Okay, very important. Now, in conclusion, give me just a few more minutes. I believe the question is this, taking us to eternity. If marriage, as many of us might feel, is the priority for the Christian on this earth, how many feel that way? The priority for the Christian on this earth is marriage. Now, I know many of you are not going to raise your hand, but the reality is, it is. I'm not saying it's right, but with many in their heart as a Christian, the priority is to get married. I know the reality. I was there. I'm married now, but I was there. You ever ask yourself that question? If it's such a good thing on this earth, which it is, why is it not in heaven? Ever ask you that? I used to just be baffled by this. Lord, I want to be married so much. Actually, I know somebody that says, I hope the rapture doesn't occur. I said, why is that? He says, I want to be married first. Now, you guys laugh, but this man was being honest. So many of us want to experience the intimacy of marriage because we don't understand the intimacy of being married to Jesus. You understand that? And this is where the Ephesians 5 passage comes in. You read this. We don't have time to read it. Read Ephesians 5 verses 22 to 33. You read this. And it always kind of intrigued me. He's giving the description of marriage. Marcy and I do this. This is our platform for premarital counseling. But you know what he's saying? I'm not talking about marriage, husband and wife. I'm talking about Christ and the church. So he takes you from the temporal to the eternal. When you see Jesus in eternity, you're not going to be married to anybody else. Now, we're thinking, well, how's that, Lord? But marriage is such a good thing in this life. I don't know how it's all going to work out. It is. The intimacy, spiritual, physically, emotionally, but it's not in heaven. So it must not be that good of a thing in heaven. Why? Because Jesus wants all good things, right? You understand that? We don't have that eternal perspective here. And that's why Jesus said clearly, there's not going to be marriage in heaven. You want to know where that is? Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 to 33. You can read that in your own time. This is when the Sadducees asked Jesus. He gave them that whole thing. It says, the same day the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him and asked Jesus, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman also died. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, right? So they're trying to give this hypothetical example. It could be just two husbands, all right? So who's they going to be married to in heaven? It's a good question, isn't it? And I love this answer because it's an answer not only for the Sadducees, it's an answer for us. Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. You Understand that? You see, for us to be so inundated with marriage here, we know not the power of God. It says, you know not the scriptures, and you know not the power of God. When you get to heaven, you're not going to even think about marriage. You know why? Because you'll be married to Jesus fully. And I don't understand it all, but this is what he says. He says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given to marriage. You know why? Because Jesus is your spouse. You understand that? And as good as marriage is on this earth, if you're married to the right person, it's not going to compare to when you're with Jesus. Face to face with him. Understand? Be content where you are, married or single. God will work out the rest. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word this morning. May you be glorified. May your spirit dwell in each one here, Lord. Help us to be satisfied with you. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand. We're going to receive communion right now as we close our services. And so Troy and David are going to release you one row at a time. I'd like to come up from the center. And then the worship team is going to play a song, and then we're going to partake together. Okay, so hold the cracker, hold the cup, return to your seats from the side down, then we'll go ahead and lead you into prayer. And we'll partake together, okay? Your grace is enough, more than I need. At your sweet word I will believe. I wait for you, draw near again. Let your spirit make me new. I will fall at your feet. I will fall at your feet. I will worship you here. Your presence in me, Jesus, light the way. By the power of your word, I am restored. I am redeemed. By your spirit I am free. And I will fall at your feet. I will fall at your feet. And I will worship you here. Really you gave it all for us. Surrendered your life upon that cross. Great is the love poured out for all. This is our God. Lifted on high from death to life. Forever our God is glorified. Servant and King, rescue the world. This is our God. I will fall at your feet. I will fall at your feet. And I will worship you here. All right, let's take a few moments, spend some time with the Lord. Let's lift him up. Well, Lord, we want to thank you for just the cross, Lord. This as we come to remember. They said to do this in remembrance of me. And this is what we do just as to be faithful, Lord, to your word, to do this, to remember all that you've done, what was accomplished at the cross of Calvary. And just as I'm thinking, Lord, I pray, my prayer for this fellowship, for all of us, is that you would bring us into that place of worship, that we would truly see you, Lord, experience your presence, and know, Lord, that it's okay right where we are, Lord. Oh, Lord, that the desire would be fully in you. That you bring us to that place. This is as we partake, Lord. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take and eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Let's partake the cracker together. And in the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Let's drink together. Oh, Lord, bless each one here, Lord. As they leave this place, may you fill them up to overflowing. May they be satisfied. Not just satisfied, but just abundantly filled, Lord. May you be enough for all of us, Lord. Physically, spiritually, emotionally, Lord. May our desire be for you alone. Everything else we'll receive, Lord, from your hand, but may our ultimate desire be you. For thou, O Lord, art high above all the earth. Thou art exalted far above all gods. For thou, O Lord, art high above all the earth. Thou art exalted far above all gods. We exalt